So it's a sunny day, school's back. It's funny, isn't it? The weather turns really nice once the schools go back. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, Book Time with Elvis with me, Mark, and I hope very much you're all doing well and ready for this new month of September, and you've got all your reading plans sorted. Though of course, if you are like me, there will probably be a considerable amount of unplanned mood reading ahead as well. I'd like to take the opportunity at this time, of course, to thank my wonderful patrons for their fantastic support. I've been absolutely bowled away by the number of people who have thus far signed up to be a patron rather, on my Patreon. And should you wish to join them, of course, the information will be, as always, down below, and you'll be most welcome. Come and try it for a week. You've got nothing to lose, and if you don't want to join after that, no worries. Interestingly, if you've been watching this channel the last few videos, you'll notice I've made some videos regarding non-fiction works, and that's kind of really what I want to talk about today, this kind of fiction versus non-fiction. Now, obviously, they're two very different things, and I enjoy reading both of them. When I kind of hit my mid to late teens, I read a lot more non-fiction, and did so pretty much until I started the BookTube channel 2.5 years ago, and I went back to reading more and more fiction. And recently I've been on this kick, as I said, of reading non-fiction. Part of that's due to the Historathon event that's running at the moment. Has been encouraging me to read more non-fiction than I have done over the last 2.5 years. And it's just got me thinking. I don't know why, but I seem to find reading non-fiction much easier than reading fiction. I'm not going to say that I don't enjoy fiction. I really do enjoy it, and there's some great fiction out there. I love 19th century and Edwardian writers and fiction especially, but there can be a lot of good fiction out there, but it takes me longer to read novels than it does works of non-fiction, and I don't know if that's the same for everybody or whether or not it is specific to each individual, and perhaps it might have something to do with your personal interests, I suppose, or how you cognitively process information, how good you are at empathy and imagining things, and maybe perhaps even some kind of links with like emotional connections, or even your own educational background might have some bearing on if you have a preference for one or the other. Now, my personal interest, if I take that into account, I absolutely adore history. My two favorite subjects at school would have been history and English literature. So that's something. I did my master's degree in political science, so I obviously at one point had an interest in politics, and I think generally the social sciences have kind of interested me. And since I've stopped being in academia, as it were, I have felt reading non-fiction to be like less of a chore and more enjoyment, I can say, even though a lot of the topics that I've been reading about recently have been quite disturbing and upsetting. The actual experience of reading, the way it's relaxed me, the way I've been able to take in that information has been enjoyable, if that makes any sense at all to you. So perhaps, given that my personal interests, apart from the general hobby of reading, tend towards things like history, then maybe it's not surprising that I have this kind of preference for non-fiction. Maybe the way I process things is a bit different. I like maybe the fact that non-fiction is probably easier to process in your mind. because you're not actually having to imagine any kind of situation. Now, I'm one of these people who definitely gets corrupted by film versions of books if I happen to see the film before I read the book. So my brain automatically takes the lazy route of imagining the characters as they appear on film, as opposed to trying to imagine them in a different way. And I think removing the element of or the need to imagine something maybe allows me to process the information contained within non-fiction works in an easier and faster way. So it feels like the speed of reading and my progress when it comes to reading non-fiction kind of really outstrips that when I read fiction. I don't know. And I'm really curious to know what your own preferences are, if you have one, and why you think you might have that particular preference. I think non-fiction is I think it's in a really golden time as well. Over the last, say, 20, 25 years, been some really, really wonderful and engaging and interesting non-fiction works published across a wide range of different subjects and genres, or that kind of thing. Where that a lot of these narratives, particularly narrative history, really do read like a novel, which is a bonus for me, even though I prefer reading that to actually reading a novel. I think when I find that the things that you can read in nonfiction are actually true and that they happen, there's something more amazing to me in that. Others might completely disagree and say, well, if you imagine something and the process of somebody building and creating a world or a universe, and I do appreciate that's extremely clever, and you can really imagine anything and do any kind of things. But when you read for example, a work on narrative history, take The Wager, which I read recently, The Wager by David Grann, about the shipwreck of His Majesty's ship, The Wager. It was a swashbuckling, rip-roaring read, and yet it's 100% true. And to me, that's kind of more amazing. People do say, don't they, the truth is stranger than fiction, and perhaps this is, as cliched as it is, perhaps there is definitely a case for that. And it can be surprising as well what subjects people have chosen to write about, and how interesting they can make them. I mean, you would think perhaps reading a book on the history of salt or the history of coffee might not be that interesting. Or perhaps you think it would be extremely interesting. But, at face value, you might think, well, that doesn't sound very exciting. And in fact, it's extremely exciting. If I take one of my favorite narrative historians, Giles Milton, he wrote, I think one of his earlier big selling books was Nathaniel's Nutmeg, which was history of the spice trade and nutmeg, and bringing it from present day Indonesia and back into Europe. And it was a really rip-roaring and exciting read. And the fact that it was true, again, kind of holds in some ways more magic for me. I don't know, that could be strange, but I definitely I think the fact that I don't have to engage my brain in imagining, the scenarios, or imagining what the characters look like, allows me to, as I say, process the information contained in nonfiction in a faster, maybe more efficient way, so I get through the books quicker, and I generally feel a bigger sense of accomplishment sometimes. I mean, don't get me wrong, earlier this year when I finished Les Miserables, I felt a huge sense of accomplishment. But of course, that did contain elements of non-fiction in it as well. And often those parts, the essays and things, the kind of tangents that Victor Hugo goes off on, is a negative for a lot of people. And for me, they were actually the best parts of the book, the kind of really special and interesting parts of the book. Now, you can argue that fiction, you have to feel kind of empathy for the characters. You have to have maybe perhaps some kind of emotional connection with them. But I feel I can form those connections and that empathy maybe in some ways stronger with non-fiction, because again, those people are real. I mean, if I form a bond with a character in a novel and that character dies, yes, it's sad, but if I feel when I'm reading a non-fiction work that the particular person being written about or being mentioned is, I'm maybe more invested in their fate because whatever happened to them really happened. I'm reading a book on slavery at the moment, which I hope to talk about later, and there are some horrific things in there, and it's a big emotional investment and a big emotional roller coaster. I mean, there was this poor woman who was I don't know if she was born into slavery in the Caribbean, but she was a slave in Antigua, and she found herself in England with her mistress. And while she was there, the mistress kind of confirmed the fact that while she was in England, she was free, and if she didn't want to go back to Antigua, she didn't have to. And if she did go back with her, then she would be kept on as a freed black woman and paid a wage. So of course, this woman agreed to go back to Antigua with her, and things worked well for a couple of months until they had a row and a falling out. And the former owner, the mistress, had her beaten, and then informed her that actually she's not free at all anymore because she's still a slave because she's back in Antigua, and it was just a horrible situation. And to me, that's far worse than anything. The emotional response from having to read something like that is far worse than anything you can read in fiction, because of course if it happens in fiction it didn't happen, whereas this poor woman, her fate, where she was free and she voluntarily goes back to Antigua and finds herself then condemned, for all I know, for the rest of her life to slavery. It's a horrible thing, and definitely the emotional trauma is far bigger than if a character in a work of fiction dies or anything like that, I would say, but I might be wrong. You see certainly far more fiction across YouTube than you do non-fiction, and that I suppose is understandable. I think maybe a lot of people read fiction because for them it's easier. Maybe it's certainly a form of escapism. And as they say, to each their own. So it's been a bit of a rambly video, but I felt it was a subject at least I wanted to mention from my point of view, how I've just noticed recently reading works of non-fiction, I tend to, my reading's more efficient, it's faster, I'm reading more, I'm reading a bigger volume. Not that it's a competition, of course, but I just feel perhaps more comfortable returning to the realms of non-fiction. But as I say, it doesn't mean I want to give up reading fiction, because I have really enjoyed it, and I've been reading some great classics as well. But it does seem for almost every novel I can read maybe 3 works of non-fiction. So I'm just curious to see what your own experiences are and what you think. Please let me know in the comments below. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Take care. Bye.